The courtroom was alive with laughter. 3 uniformed officers sat comfortably at the defense table, their smug grins on full display. The judge, leaning back in his chair, shook his head in amusement. At the front of the room, 2 black men stood side by side, identical twins, silent, unmoved. Sergeant Roy Callahan smirked. "Nice try, boys," he said, chuckling. "But this isn't some action movie. You're not getting out of this one." The other officers laughed along with him. The defense lawyer didn't even bother looking up. The whole courtroom already knew the outcome. But the twins, they knew something no one else did. One of them reached into his pocket, pulled out a flash drive, and placed it on the table. "Your Honor," Malcolm Wright said, voice steady, "before you rule, there's something you should know." The officers stopped laughing. Because what was coming next? It would change everything. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe for more gripping stories. The courtroom fell silent. All eyes were on the small flash drive sitting on the wooden table. The judge stiffened slightly, shifting in his chair. The 3 officers, Callahan, Reynolds, and Evans, exchanged glances. A moment ago, they were laughing. Now, they were watching, waiting, uncertain. The courtroom itself was grand but suffocating. Tall ceilings, wooden panels, portraits of past judges staring down like ghosts. It was a place that had seen many trials, but very few victories for men like Malcolm and Marcus Wright. On the defense side, Sergeant Roy Callahan sat with his arms crossed, his smirk slowly fading. Next to him, Officer Luke Reynolds cracked his knuckles, trying to mask his nerves. And at the end, Detective Carl Evans shifted uncomfortably, his knee bouncing beneath the table. They had walked into this courtroom believing the system would protect them. After all, it always had before. Malcolm and Marcus stood tall, identical in appearance, but distinct in energy. Malcolm, the older twin by 3 minutes, was sharp-tongued and fearless. His suit was impeccably tailored, his movements deliberate. The kind of man who never showed his cards until the moment was right. Marcus, quieter but just as dangerous, was the strategist. He watched before he spoke, studied before he moved. If Malcolm was the voice, Marcus was the mind. To the courtroom, they looked like 2 black men fighting a losing battle. But in reality, they were holding all the cards. Sergeant Roy Callahan, leader, arrogant, mid-40s white, a man who built his career on intimidation and corruption. He wasn't just a bad cop, he was a predator in uniform. Officer Luke Reynolds, brutal, reckless, early 40s, the type who enjoyed the power that came with his badge. His fists spoke before his words. Detective Carl Evans, jittery, mid-30s. Unlike the others, Evans wasn't fully committed to this life. He followed orders, but he wasn't blind. And now, sitting in this courtroom, he felt something he wasn't used to feeling: fear. Callahan and his men had framed Malcolm and Marcus for a crime they didn't commit. They had planted evidence, fabricated reports, and assumed their word would always matter more than 2 black men's innocence. But what they didn't know, what no one in the courtroom knew, was that Malcolm and Marcus weren't just any men. They weren't victims. They were hunters. And today, they had set the perfect trap. Callahan leaned forward, forcing a smirk back onto his face. "What's this?" he scoffed, tapping the flash drive. "A last-minute plea for mercy." Malcolm smiled. Not a desperate smile, a knowing one. Marcus took a deep breath, then looked directly at the judge. "Before you rule," he said, voice steady, "I think it's time we show you exactly who we are." Reynolds rolled his eyes. Evans stopped bouncing his knee. And Callahan? For the first time, he looked unsure, because something about Malcolm and Marcus felt different now. They weren't the ones on trial anymore. They were in control, and that terrified him. The courtroom remained eerily silent as Malcolm and Marcus stood motionless, their expressions unreadable. A few minutes ago, they were just two defendants, just another case the system would bury. Now, they controlled the room. Judge Robert Whittaker cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. His confidence had wavered the moment that flash drive hit the table. "Mr. Wright," the judge said, adjusting his glasses, "if this is some last-minute stunt, It's not," Malcolm interrupted, his voice calm. "This is evidence." Callahan snorted. He leaned back in his chair, his arrogance slowly returning. "Oh, give me a break," he scoffed. "What could possibly be on that little toy that changes a thing?" Reynolds chuckled. Evans, however? He wasn't laughing. Marcus tilted his head slightly, watching Evans. "Good. He's already breaking." The prosecutor, a middle-aged man named Alan Mercer, shifted uncomfortably. He had been so sure of this case. The evidence was airtight. The judge was on their side. But now, he could feel something shifting. Still, he forced himself to act. "Objection, Your Honor," Mercer said quickly. "This is highly irregular. This so-called evidence should have been submitted before trial." Malcolm turned to him. His stare was sharp, calculated. "You sound nervous, Mr. Mercer." A few whispers rippled through the courtroom. The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. He was clearly annoyed, but he had no choice. "Overruled. Let's see what you've got." "Mr. Wright?" A court officer retrieved a laptop, plugging the flash drive into the system. The large screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. Marcus reached forward, clicking a file labeled "Play Me First." The video began. At first, nothing but black and white security footage. Then, a timestamp, a location, and three familiar figures: Callahan, Reynolds, Evans. The courtroom collectively inhaled. Callahan's smirk vanished. Reynolds sat up straighter, his jaw clenched. Evans' face lost all color. Because on the screen, there they were, planting evidence. The footage was clear, crystal clear. Callahan pulling a gun from his waistband, one that wasn't his. Reynolds placing it on the floor next to a broken car window. Evans standing watch, his hands trembling. The audio played over the speakers. "Relax, Evans." Callahan's voice rang through the courtroom. "Nobody's going to question this. Two black men, middle of the night, open and shut case." The courtroom erupted into gasps. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth. A journalist furiously scribbled notes. The defense attorney was frozen. The prosecutor looked sick. Judge Whittaker? His face had gone blank. Callahan shot up from his chair. "This is fake," he barked. This is edited footage. You really think anyone's going to believe this?" Malcolm smiled for the first time. That was just the warm-up. Marcus clicked another file. This time, emails, confidential reports, payoffs, not just about the case, but about other cases, other arrests, bribes, cover-ups, deals with judges, prosecutors, high-ranking officials. The Department of Justice had been sitting on this information for months. And Malcolm and Marcus, they weren't just defendants, they were undercover investigators. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Callahan looked at the screen, then back at Malcolm and Marcus. Reynolds shook his head. No, this isn't Evans." He looked like he might pass out. Callahan turned to him, his voice deadly. "You knew about this?" Evans didn't answer, because now he was afraid of both sides. Judge Whittaker stared at the screen, his hands gripping the bench. Because in the files, his name was there too. Marcus tilted his head. "Problem, Your Honor?" Whittaker could barely breathe. Because now everyone in this courtroom knew the truth, and there was no escaping it. Malcolm folded his arms. Marcus leaned forward, and then Malcolm simply said, "Now, let's talk about your options." The courtroom exploded. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Voices overlapped, gasps filled the air, and the once smug defense team sat frozen. The screen continued playing, exposing layer after layer of corruption, lies, and cover-ups. The officers, Callahan, Reynolds, and Evans, watched in horror, because now they were the ones on trial. Judge Robert Whitaker banged his gavel hard. Order, order in this court. But his voice held no power anymore, because his name was in those files too. And now, everyone knew it. Sergeant Roy Callahan finally found his voice. He shoved back his chair, standing with his hands clenched into fists. "This is a goddamn witch hunt," he roared. "This is a setup. You can't just—" Malcolm took a slow step forward, cutting him off. "Can't just—" "What?" he asked, tilting his head. Callahan stopped. Because Malcolm's voice, it was too calm, too in control. Officer Luke Reynolds wasn't waiting around. He shot up from his chair, moving toward the exit as casually as possible. But before he could reach the door, 3 men in black suits stepped forward. FBI agents. And just like that, the door was no longer an option. Marcus leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "You still don't get it, do you?" Callahan, breathing hard, glared. "You think this little stunt is going to save you?" he spat. "You're still 2 nobodies in a system that—" Marcus cut him off. "We're not nobodies." Malcolm pulled out a small, black leather wallet, flipped it open, flashed a badge. The courtroom went dead silent. Marcus did the same. And then Malcolm spoke 3 words that changed everything. "Department of Justice." The words hit like a hammer. A journalist dropped her pen. The public gasped. Even the defense attorney, who had been so sure of victory, let out a strangled noise of disbelief. Judge Whitaker's hand gripped the edge of his bench. His fingers turned white. And Callahan? His entire body locked up. "No," he whispered. Marcus nodded. "Yes." Reynolds stumbled backward into his chair. Evans let out a shaky breath, running a hand over his face, because suddenly, this wasn't just about one case. This was bigger, deeper, a setup, but not the one they thought. Callahan shook his head. "You're lying," Malcolm smirked. "Really?" He motioned to the FBI agents by the door. "Because I think they'd disagree." Judge Whitaker wiped his forehead with a shaking hand. He had spent years helping men like Callahan, and now there was no one left to help him. The agents took a step forward. Malcolm and Marcus watched as the weight of the truth finally sank in. Callahan was breathing heavily, panicked, searching for an escape. Reynolds was already done, staring blankly at the table. And Evans? Evans looked ready to confess. Marcus noticed, and so he went in for the kill. Marcus turned to Evans, his voice softer now. "You're not like them." Evans looked up, startled. Callahan snapped, "Don't you dare!" But Marcus kept going. "You didn't plant that gun. You didn't rough up that kid. You followed orders, but you never led them." Evans swallowed hard. Marcus leaned in. "You have a choice." The courtroom waited. And then Evans made it. "I'll talk," he blurted. "I'll tell you everything." Callahan let out a snarl. "You spineless little—" "Sit down, Sergeant." Malcolm's voice cut through the chaos. Callahan froze, because suddenly he was outnumbered. An FBI agent stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "Roy Callahan, Luke Reynolds, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, falsifying evidence, conspiracy, and civil rights violations." Click, click. The handcuffs snapped shut. The courtroom exploded into noise. A woman in the gallery burst into tears. A journalist was already on the phone with a news station. And Malcolm? He turned to Marcus. "I think it's time we go." Marcus nodded. The twins walked out of the courtroom together, leaving behind the system they had just cracked wide open. And as they stepped into the hallway, Marcus sighed. "Think they'll learn," Malcolm smirked. "Number, but the next ones will be more careful." And with that, they disappeared into the crowd. Justice wasn't given today. It was taken. The courtroom was in chaos. Reporters rushed to capture the moment. The crowd buzzed with energy, their voices blending into a wave of disbelief and satisfaction. But the loudest sound? The metallic snap of handcuffs locking around Callahan's wrists. His face twisted in rage, his breathing ragged. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had spent years twisting the system, bending it to his will. But now, the system had turned on him. Officer Luke Reynolds had gone eerily still. His jaw was clenched, his hands trembling. It was clear he was playing out every possible escape in his head, but there was none. Detective Carl Evans sat with his head in his hands. He had cracked first. He had spilled everything. And now, he was the only one who might get a deal. Marcus watched him closely. Evans had been the weak link all along, and they had played him perfectly. Judge Robert Whitaker had remained seated, unmoving, but his fingers were gripping the edge of his desk so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Because he knew. His name had been all over those files. The bribes, the cover-ups, the rulings that weren't just mistakes, they were intentional. For years, he had let men like Callahan win. And now, there was nothing he could do. He lifted his gaze to Malcolm and Marcus, who were standing near the exit. Malcolm turned one last time, meeting the judge's eyes. "This is what justice looks like," he said, his voice steady. The words hung in the air. For the first time in his career, Judge Whitaker was speechless. "Hey," a new voice echoed through the courtroom. "Robert Whitaker, you're under investigation for judicial misconduct and conspiracy." Gasps rippled through the audience. The judge's face drained of color. Two FBI agents stepped forward. One of them held out a piece of paper. "This is an official order from the Department of Justice. Effective immediately, you are removed from the bench." A thick silence settled over the courtroom. And then, a single clap. Then another, and another, until the entire courtroom erupted in applause. Callahan thrashed against his restraints. "This is a setup. This is enough." An agent cut him off. "You're done." Reynolds said nothing. Evans? He didn't fight. He didn't argue, because he had already made his choice. As they were led away, Marcus turned to Malcolm. "That felt good," he muttered. Malcolm smirked. "Better than good." The moment Malcolm and Marcus stepped out of the courtroom, cameras flashed in their faces. "Who are you, really?" a reporter demanded. "How long has this been planned?" "What's next for the Department of Justice?" Malcolm held up a hand, silencing them all. He took a deep breath, and then he spoke the words that would be quoted in every headline. "Power only protects the corrupt until the truth catches up to them." And with that, the Wright twins walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Their job was done. Justice had been served. The courtroom doors swung shut behind Malcolm and Marcus, but the impact of what had just happened rippled through the entire justice system. For years, men like Callahan, Reynolds, and Judge Whitaker had controlled the outcome of trials, bending justice to suit their needs. But now, the system had turned on them. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, major headlines dominated every media outlet. FBI takes down corrupt police network in shocking courtroom revelation. Judge Whitaker removed from the bench, facing federal indictment. Mass investigation launched into police department following DOJ intervention. The once untouchable men were now being escorted through police stations in handcuffs. facing the same fate they had forced upon countless innocent people. But the real victory, it wasn't just about them. It was about the message that had been sent to every corrupt officer, every dirty judge, and every prosecutor who had ever put power before justice. No one was above the law. Outside the courthouse, a massive crowd had gathered. Some were cheering, some were crying, and some, they just stood in awe. For years, they had watched the system work against them. But today, the system had been forced to answer for its crimes. A young black woman, clutching a notebook filled with years of wrongful convictions, wiped her tears. She had stopped believing justice was possible until today. A reporter turned to an older man standing in the crowd. "What do you think about what just happened?" The man, who had seen too many trials end in injustice, shook his head. "It's about damn time." Malcolm and Marcus walked calmly through the mob of reporters, their suits still crisp, their expressions unreadable. Microphones were shoved toward them. "How long have you been investigating this? Were you undercover the whole time? Did you know it would end like this?" Malcolm paused. He turned slightly, just enough for the cameras to capture his face. "Justice is not a privilege," he said. "It's a right." And with that, they kept walking. Meanwhile, in a separate holding room, Detective Carl Evans sat alone. For the first time in his career, he wasn't on the other side of the table. Now, he was the one being questioned. The door creaked open. Marcus stepped inside. Evans sat up straighter, his eyes filled with nerves. I told you I'd help," Evans stammered. "I gave you names, Marcus studied him. Then he slid a piece of paper across the table. "A confession. You want to prove you're different?" Marcus said. "Sign it." Evans swallowed hard. His hands shook. For years, he'd hidden behind his badge. Now, there was nowhere left to hide. Slowly, with a deep breath, he picked up the pen, and he signed. In the weeks that followed, mass investigations were launched. Officers were fired. Judges were removed. Cases were reopened. For the first time in a long time, the system was being held accountable. But Malcolm and Marcus, they were already on their next mission. Because corruption didn't end in one courtroom. It was everywhere. And they weren't finished yet. Late that night, Malcolm and Marcus sat in a quiet diner, coffee cups in hand. The news played on a small TV in the corner. Justice was served today in a shocking courtroom revelation. Marcus exhaled. "Think they'll learn?" Malcolm smirked. "No." He took a sip of his coffee. "But the next ones will be more careful." And with that, the twins paid their bill, walked outside, and disappeared into the night. Justice wasn't just about winning. It was about making sure they never lost again. The night was quiet, as Malcolm and Marcus disappeared into the city, their mission complete. But the impact of what they did, that would last forever. For years, the system had protected the corrupt, silenced the innocent, and made a mockery of justice. But today, that cycle was broken. Because the truth always comes out. The people who sat in that courtroom, watching history unfold, would never forget this day. Some would say it was just another case. But for those who had been wrongfully accused, who had lost loved ones to corruption, who had been told they would never win, this was proof that justice is possible. It's not easy. It's not freely given. But when the right people fight for it, it's unstoppable. What do you think should happen to corrupt cops and judges? Should they face harsher penalties, or is exposing them enough? Let us know in the comments. If you believe in fighting for truth and justice, make sure to like this video, share it with others, subscribe for more powerful stories, because the fight for justice never ends. Thank you for watching. See you in the next gripping story.